Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
4 days from now, Americans will vote in midterm elections. Hoping to keep Republican control of the House and Senate, President Trump used the campaign rally to ramp up his hardline immigration plans. He pledged to line the border with troops and build tent cities for migrants caught trying to cross. The measures are designed to stop a caravan of Central American migrants still hundreds of miles away from the US. Here's our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris.
In the early hours of this morning, just as they have every day for the past few weeks, people began to move to carry their caravan one stop closer to America. If they're aware, they're undeterred by President Trump's increasingly hostile rhetoric toward them. He's motivated by an election only days away, while many of them are fleeing for their lives.
We're not going with the intention to fight anyone. We want the president to give us open passage, because if we're migrating, it's not because we're bad people, it's because we're hard-working people. And I think we can benefit the US, because the ones who do the work are us, the Central Americans.
Although their number has diminished slightly, they still travel in their thousands, stopping to regain their strength each night and dream of America. We watched people gather around a map in the state of Oaxaca, looking at the routes they might take north. Someone had written, "You are here," at the bottom, something you'd more likely see in a shopping centre than on a 1,000-mile migratory trek. Poring over the same maps now, US military planners tasked with heading off what the president has hyperbolically dubbed the invasion. In the migrant caravan overview leaked to Newsweek magazine, see the lines with arrows representing the various routes that might be chosen by the migrants. They note it could take 15 days for anyone to reach Texas and the best part of a month for the caravan to reach Arizona and California. Also noted on the map, their MLCOA, most likely course of action. What's most likely to happen? Caravan dwindles as it nears US. Limited TCO, that's transnational criminal organisation, exploitation, and no terrorist infiltration. Balloon effect on smuggling. Based on historic trends, it's assessed that only a small percentage of the migrants will likely reach the border. Not much of an invasion after all. The military describes its mission as providing support to Customs and Border Patrol. The president hopes they won't have to use force, but doesn't rule out an armed response to people throwing stones.
We're not going to put up with that. They want to throw rocks at our military fights back. We're going to consider it, and I told them, consider it a rifle. When they throw rocks like they did at the Mexico military and police, I say, consider it a rifle.
If you're wondering what the military might be thinking about their commander-in-chief's advice they should consider a rock a rifle, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has tweeted, "A wasteful deployment of overstretched soldiers and Marines would be made much worse if they use force disproportional to the threat they face. They won't." The Defense Department has released video of US troops from Kentucky deploying to the border in southern Arizona. While those troops head west, the president is taking his midterms caravan to West Virginia and Indiana today. Last night he was in Missouri to boost the chances for the Republican candidate in a tight race for a Senate seat currently held by a Democrat.
The Democrat agenda is the agenda of the extreme far left. They've gone crazy, folks. They've gone totally loco. Republicans want strong borders, no crime, no chaos, and no caravans.
It's a line to draw cheers from his supporters. We'll know next week whether it's drawn enough votes to keep the Republicans in control of Congress. The president, again, in just the last half hour, has been asked questions about his comment suggesting that soldiers might be justified in using force in responding to people throwing rocks at the border. He's now said that he hoped they won't, that any soldier who is struck by a projectile should go ahead and arrest people instead. When he was asked, is he creating violence with his rhetoric, he said, pointing to a reporter, "You're creating violence by your question. The fake news is creating violence."
OK, and when he tweets sanctions are coming, what does he mean?
Well, he means that on Sunday night, effectively, Krish, the US will restore in full force the sanctions that it applied against Tehran before the Iran nuclear deal was signed. Now, it had threatened back in May when President Trump walked away from the deal that there would be a 180-day wind-down period, so those businesses who were working with Iran in the energy, shipping and banking sectors had time to get out. Effectively, now their time is up. I think the question really, though, for the European Union is, what will they do? We know that 8 countries won't be penalised for their Iranian oil imports. That full list will be released on Monday, as you mentioned, but they happen to include, as far as we understand it, India, Italy, Japan and Turkey. Now, the EU had said that it was going to do what it could to allow firms to continue to do business with Iran and bypass US sanctions, but the question is whether they can effectively protect those companies against the reach of the US government. The Americans may be acting on their own here, but they are resolutely continuing, saying that they're doing so in order to fundamentally alter Tehran's behaviour.
Thanks, Kylie. Well, joining me now via the internet is the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, the Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat. Well, what should Britain do? Is it prepared to face down the possibility of sanctions itself?
Well, I think what's important is that we maintain both proximity to our allies in the United States and cooperation with our friends in France and Germany and other European countries. What we're dealing with here is a regime in Tehran that sees, quite happy to murder many of its internal rivals, but particularly people with whom it has disagreements, such as homosexuals, many women, and is currently acting as a hostage taker, holding an innocent mother of a very young child away from her family, now getting on for the 3rd year.
So you're sounding more sympathetic to Donald Trump's sanctions than Britain's thus far attempts to try and get round them?
Well, I think what's important is that we maintain pressure on the regime, and I don't think there's much difference between us on that. Look, personally, I think this regime has done so many extraordinarily awful things that the sooner the Iranian people are liberated from the brutality of the theocracy, the happier we will all be. And particularly as we see it export violence into Bahrain, into Yemen, and indeed, of course, most obviously and most brutally into Iraq and Syria, where it's conducting now the 7th or 8th year of an extremely horrific campaign of brutality against the Syrian people. So, we should be under no illusion that the Iranian regime is utterly brutal. So I'm not particularly appalled by Donald Trump's sanctions. I mean, I wish that he had done it in a more cooperative fashion. I think holding together with the French and the Germans would be the right way to do it. But the idea that he's taking any form of illegal or sort of illicit action here is simply not true. He's dealing robustly with a regime that has, in so many ways, violated every international norm.
But is the nuclear deal effectively dead or not? I mean, when he said he was pulling the plug, Europe was saying, well, we'll try and carry on going. Where have we ended up now?
Well, the nuclear deal was extremely narrow, and it's one of the reasons I've always been so critical of it, because it was so narrow. It applied to only the very, very, very most technical area of nuclear production. It didn't, for example, include missile technology. It didn't include the export of violence into Syria. It did not stop the Revolutionary Guard murdering people around the region. It didn't stop them funneling money into terrorist groups. It didn't stop any of the mass areas of violence that the Iranian government has used the money that it got when the sanctions were lifted under the nuclear deal. It didn't stop any of the actions that they then took with that money. They didn't build schools and they didn't build hospitals with it. They spent it on the war in Syria and on murdering thousands of people. OK. While you're with us, can I just ask you about one other issue that is sort of on your plate on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee? I mean, there is now a NCA investigation into the conduct of one of the Brexit campaigns, and there have been allegations in the media that the Prime Minister blocked a request for an investigation into the Brexiteer donor Aaron Banks. Do you think there should be now some sort of Mueller-style wider investigation into the Brexit campaign? We don't have the same system as the Americans, so I wouldn't suggest that. But what I do suggest we do is we have an absolutely robust investigation into foreign attempts to subvert democracy in the United Kingdom. And I think that's extremely important. We know that the Russian government has been active in many other countries and has been conducting assassinations and attempted assassinations in the United Kingdom. So it seems unlikely that they weren't trying to influence our elections in various ways. I mean, I suspect they didn't succeed, and I certainly don't suspect that the results of our elections have been changed significantly by foreign action. But I do think that it's essential that the intelligence agencies look hard at the most important elements of our society, and that's not, of course, just things like power and water and other such infrastructure. It's also how we conduct our democracy, and so I hope very much that that's exactly what they'll be doing.
Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much.
For people across America, next week's midterm elections are the first real chance to have a say on President Trump since the moment he stunned the world with that original election victory. And whilst much of the focus has been on where his Republican Party is under threat, that is far from the only story. Whilst the Midwestern state of Minnesota is traditionally a Democrat stronghold, that grip has rather weakened in recent years. Indeed, Donald Trump only narrowly lost the state in 2016. But in the 8th congressional district, where mining and shipping dominate, the support of blue-collar workers helped him to actually defeat Hillary Clinton. And 2 years on, the Republicans may be about to repeat that success, with many in the port city of Duluth crediting him with creating jobs and turning the economy around.
The future wasn't always this bright in the American Midwest. 3 years ago, this family-owned business had to lay off more than half its workers. Now they're back, the upward curve in the economy sparking a rush of orders and a newfound respect for the president.
You know, I like Donald. He's a bit of a spitfire, but, you know, he gets the job done. He doesn't take no for an answer, and I like that.
Cheap Chinese imports had turned Minnesota's iron and steelworks into a shadow of their former selves. Trump's tariffs and tax cuts changed that, and something else too.
The state of Minnesota has been Democratic for my whole life. I've been here for 40 years at Industrial, and back in 78, 79, it was probably in the shop, it was probably 80-20, 80% Democrat, 20% Republican, and now it's actually balanced out. So this could be the first year that Minnesota could go red rather than being Democratic.
It would be quite a shift. Duluth, on the shores of the vast Lake Superior, is the biggest inland port in the world. Like many blue-collar towns, it had been struggling, and whether or not it started with Obama's policies or Trump's, the conditions for a strong recovery have been falling into place. But the way ahead may not be quite so smooth.
The goods in these containers are manufactured here in the Midwest, but they're on their way to Asia. Trump's trade war with China could have a significant effect on exports like these and the companies that make them.
Nowhere do they know better than here how easily spooked investors can be. The dumping of Chinese steel closed iron mines here, with thousands laid off. They need Trump to keep talking to Beijing to protect the recovery.
I think what so many people up here have noticed is that we've had a significant uptick in the level of economic activity. The 2,000 miners were called back, those facilities reopened, and now we're investing in our facilities too, so we're making them more globally competitive.
That journey back to prosperity is far from universal. On the tugs that compete to help cargo ships into port, business is still slow. But in this job, patience comes easily.
Trump is actually the first guy we've had in quite a long time that he's actually trying to fix some of the problems. He's not a political insider. He's kind of he's a businessman. He's looking at it in a business sense.
And having steadily built up their own fleet, both father and son are willing to extend the same long view to their president.
Not much going on today, though.
Especially when they consider the alternative.
We've had enough of this. We really have. We've had enough of this crazy liberal policies. So, do I think Trump is the best spokesman? No, I don't. But he's what we've got.
And he might just be around for an awful lot longer if his party can turn the tide in blue-collar areas like this one. Rachel Younger, News at 10, Duluth.
Now, it is the final weekend before America's crucial crucial midterm elections, and President Trump has declared that he'll just figure it out if the Democrats win control of the House of Representatives. Many races are simply too close to call, like Georgia, where Barack Obama has been supporting Stacey Abrams' hopes of becoming America's first black female governor.
Expecting your elected officials not to just make stuff up. That's not a Democratic or Republican issue. It shouldn't be Democratic or Republican to say that we don't try to monkey around with the rules of our democracy, that we don't threaten the freedom of the press just because they write something about us we don't like. It should not be a matter of partisan politics to say we don't target certain groups of people based on what they look like, or how they pray, or who they love.
Now, in a state known as the birthplace of the civil rights movement, there are now accusations that state authorities are placing obstacles in the way of some seeking to cast their ballots. More often than not, it seems to be African-American voters who are affected by this. From Georgia, here's Kieran Moodley.
Like so many key states in the midterms, early voter turnout has surged in Georgia. The races are tight. Every vote counts. But there are fears here that it won't be a fair fight, that voters are being suppressed. Marsha Appling Nunes moved to Atlanta in 2016. She's voted in every election since she turned 18. But since moving to Georgia, she found registering to vote an uphill battle.
They couldn't find me as a registered voter. And I thought, well, it's got to be some sort of mistake, so I tried it again.
How many times do we think?
At least 40 plus times.
Marsha found her voter registration was pending because of a recent change known as the exact match law. That legislation says that if your application doesn't match exactly with other government records on file, your registration is placed on hold.
Voter suppression is kind of something you've read about. It happens over there. You know, it happens somewhere else, not in 2018, not in Atlanta, such an international city.
Keep moving forward, keep moving forward.
A recent Associated Press study found that 53,000 people had been placed on the pending list, and a federal judge recently declared that more than 3,000 of those were incorrectly listed as non-citizens, and that they should be allowed to vote. Data from the Georgia Secretary of State's office shows that the vast majority of those placed on the pending list are African American. That racial disparity reopens deep wounds.
Led by famed integrationist Martin Luther King.
Georgia is the birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of his major achievements was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that ensured African Americans were no longer prevented from voting. But in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down part of that historic act, and now the government no longer needs to approve electoral changes in individual states. In the last 5 years, a number of states have changed their voting laws, from North Dakota to Florida to right here in Georgia. Strict voter ID requirements have been introduced, and inactive voters removed from the electoral roll. Authorities say it's to stop people voting in more than one state and to ultimately prevent electoral fraud. But what complicates matters here is that the man who made those election changes is now running in the election to become one of the most powerful politicians in Georgia.
I got a big truck, just in case I need to round up criminal illegals and take them home myself.
Brian Kemp is a Republican firmly in the Donald Trump mold.
If you want a politically incorrect conservative, that's me.
His opponent, Stacey Abrams, claims he is trying to purge the electoral roll of minority votes at a time when she is hoping to become America's first female African-American governor.
This is someone who takes credit for more people registering to vote, despite the fact that he purges voters at a regular interval.
This is all a distraction to take away from Miss Abrams' extreme agenda that she has.
For African-American activists, the combination of alleged voter suppression and an historic candidate means this is history in the making, as well as history being repeated.
It's a sad commentary, though, that we've got to relive and go back to fight for some rights that we thought we had achieved with that Voting Rights Act.
Cliff Albright is the founder of the Black Votes Matter group. This bus is traveling across Georgia, picking up black voters and taking them to the polls.
Before there was a fear of a blue wave, there's always been a fear of a black wave. That's why this bus is so intimidating to some folks, because when they see the words of power that's on the side of this bus, the first thing that they think of, if those black folks have power, they will eventually do to us what we did to them.
They've driven 2 hours outside of Atlanta to the town of Warner Robins to help local activists get out the vote.
When I say black folks, you say matter. Black folks matter. Black folks matter.
So have you had friends and family who feel scared to vote?
Yeah.
And what do they say?
I mean, it's just like, y'all go ahead and vote. It don't matter.
And is it hard to get people to go and vote?
Oh, yes. I mean, they come up with the damnest excuses.
Is that because of the history of what's happened, especially
Yes,
for African Americans?
Exactly, because every time we get to the goal line about something, they'll push the goal line back farther.
Moving the goalposts has also meant moving the polling booths. More than 200 polling stations have closed across Georgia since 2012, with the government saying it's to save money. Despite these closures and talk of voter suppression, activists say such tactics will backfire.
We are seeing a massive of people, African Americans, coming out now to vote because of voter suppression.
So African Americans aren't intimidated?
No, they're not. In fact, they are excited and raring to go.
Brian Kemp says that despite any claim to the contrary, it has never been easier to register to vote in Georgia and actively engage in the electoral process. His office told us that Marsha has always been registered and that even people on the pending list are still able to vote. When Marsha finally went to the polls, she made sure she took every bit of identification she had. How was that? You voted?
Encouraging.
Yeah?
Yeah, there's nice lines in there.
Got your sticker?
Earned it. It almost feels like my first election again when I was 18 and got to vote. Mission complete, you know?
With America so polarized, who wins in the midterms will depend on which party can get out their base. In Georgia, will the battle over voting rights keep people at home or energize them to make a stand?
Kieran Woodley reporting from Georgia. Well, in New York, Jon Snow has been talking to Janaea Butler about claims of voter suppression and accusations that Trump immigration policy is racist. She's the unabashed pro-Trump Republican candidate in the predominantly African-American district of Harlem.
In the South in particular, there's genuine fears that there is voter suppression.
Absolutely.
And voter suppression of some of the sorts of people you'd find in Harlem, in the district you're running in.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's not a good thing.
Well, see, I think there's voter suppression on both sides, and I think that we only look at it from one point of view because it's blatant on one side, right? It's blatant when you're, cutting people off at the polls, but it's also blatant when you're telling African Americans the only thing that they can be in America is a Democrat. So that's a form of voter suppression too.
The Democrats have always been more sympathetic and more embracing of the ethnic minorities.
We're going emotional, and what we need are results, right? And so if we're emotional, the Democrats have played the card towards African-American communities across America and have bet on African-American community for that vote, but hasn't made sure that those African-American communities change during that time that they're showing all the sympathy. And so I think that's the bigger problem.
This is also going to be a vote testing how people feel about the Trump presidency.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think Mr. Trump loves you?
I think he absolutely loves me. Now, I think that he's a different...
Does he love black people?
I think he does.
He shows it in a very funny way.
Well,
he called the mayor of Tallahassee the other day, or the candidate, he called him a thief.
I think he doesn't care what color, but I don't think he doesn't care what color who he's criticizing or who, I don't think he cares the color.
He's got a very white administration.
Well, and because guess what? The African Americans were told resist, don't go into the administration. And see, that's where I'm standing. Whereas though that we have to have allies on both sides of the spectrum. We can't let one side of this go so far to the right that we're not even involved.
What would make you feel you could go and work for him?
Well,
that's a difficult question to answer.
Yes, it is, because there's so much scrutiny behind it. Like in America, I feel like Trump is the boss that everybody loves to hate, right? So I think that in America, he mimics the boss that we all just hate, that's going to do the craziest things, just the stuff. But I think that we still have to push that envelope. We still can't back up just because he's a new kind of character. We can't back down. We can't say we're not going to deal with this president at all. How many presidents in the United States have ever been for the black cause, right? Before Barack Obama. So we've gotten a little spoiled in our way these days. And so what I'm saying is we've never had a president that was totally for us and that, the agenda was a black agenda.
Barack
We've never
Obama.
had that.
You mentioned
Absolutely.
Obama, and Obama brought in Obamacare, and we find that healthcare is one of the biggest concerns in this election.
Absolutely.
But Mr. Trump doesn't want Obamacare.
People have to elect people in their area so we can fight and push back towards things that, we all may not want.
So you're fighting from within rather than from without?
Well, I think that you have to fight from every angle. I think that you don't leave anything undone. I'm a basketball player, so I feel like you got to balance the floor, you got to cover every position, you got to make sure that even somebody on your team might be weak every now and then, and you have to back them up too.
I've wondered whether you personally have suffered any abuse. I doubt it,
No.
as you're black and
No.
you're in Harlem.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Are you aware of it?
I'm very aware of it, and I feel like this is a complete version of the Crips and the Bloods. Like there's a whole gang war. Like we talk about, violence going on in the streets, but now this is in the political spectrum, and this is really big. And again, I've always been the player that can come into the game and change the game.
So you could be doing that.
Well, my community is 58% Democratic. So I would have to be a Democratic ally. But me being a Republican, them being a Democrat, puts us in a neutral seat and puts us in a very powerful position. And that's what I'm looking at, to where it's not a red wave, it's not a blue wave, but it's a Harlem wave.
Junior Butler,
Yes.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, from one hard-fought electoral battle to another, the United States is days away from congressional midterms, a vote widely seen as a referendum on the Trump presidency. The Democrats are going all out to capture the House of Representatives, and if they win, they could hobble the president and maybe even do things that would lead to his impeachment. Emily is in Washington.
Well, thanks very much and good evening from Washington, where we report tonight on one of the most controversial races in the whole country. Georgia could deliver American history next week in the shape of the first black female governor the nation has ever seen. Oprah Winfrey was in town there yesterday. President Obama is there tonight. But the battle is mired in controversy. Accusations of voter suppression have surfaced. Thousands of minority voters find themselves removed from the ballot. All this in a state with a world-famous history of racial discrimination.
Evening worship at the Baptist Church is a full-throated affair. A congregation unafraid to raise its voice in prayer or psalm. But this week, they're being asked to participate in more earthly matters too.
Everybody has this right, and thank God for this right to vote. And that inspires me to vote when I see people trying to take my right away. It takes me back to my forefathers when you couldn't vote. Because they had us as slaves, but I ain't a slave no more.
That message has a special urgency right here and right now. Just days away from midterm elections, they're being encouraged to vote early just to make sure nothing goes wrong.
In the soul of America's deep south lies Georgia. Now, electoral folklore will tell you they don't see political upsets here very often. Its recent history, its heart, are a deep, sonorous red. Bill Clinton was the last president to turn it blue, and that was more than 25 years ago. Yet this time round, there is a nail-biting race, the outcome of which could determine not just who gets to govern, but who is even allowed to vote.
Meet Stacey Abrams. If she wins here next week, she'll be the first black female governor the country has ever seen. She's spent years fighting changes, championed by Georgia's Secretary of State, that have removed thousands of people from the electoral register. Those changes appear to hit ethnic minority voters most, who, guess what, tend to vote Democrat.
Are you worried about voters being removed from the ballot here in Georgia?
I'm concerned about voter suppression, but the antidote to voter suppression is voter engagement. He has made it his mission to tilt the playing field. We can win by overwhelming the voting box with the number of eligible voters, and his concern is right. He is concerned that if everyone who's eligible votes, then he will not win, and we intend to prove him right.
Do you see anything else you would like?
Those are often the people hardest to reach, a demographic with less sense of entitlement, which is why a free registration service is now offered at the local food bank, helping low-income families with their paperwork.
Requiring voter IDs is a form of voter suppression in the sense that it's almost like a poll tax, because the cost a lot of times for getting an ID is prohibitive for certain groups of people. And so when you have to pay $32 for your ID itself and possibly up to $60, $75 for your birth certificate, now you're deciding on getting food or paying bills and getting an ID. But then when you don't have an ID, when it comes to jobs and getting housing and other things, so it becomes a hard circle for people to get out of.
It's hard to talk about voting in the South without going back to the civil rights movement and Atlanta's most famous son, Martin Luther King. Because of the racist disenfranchisement that existed here for decades, Georgia was put on a watch list of states with a history of discrimination. It meant any change to voting measures had to be pre-approved by federal government.
5 years ago, the US Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, allowing Georgia to make the rules for registration much stricter. The result was overwhelming. The Associated Press reported that 670,000 people were purged from the electoral roll last year alone. The question is this: how much of that was intentional racial voter suppression?
Now you're ready for Election Day.
The reasons people find themselves removed are various and complicated. Polling stations shut down, updated rolls, perhaps a change of address. But the most frequently heard problem this time is one they call the exact match policy. A missing hyphen, comma, or different spelling can invalidate the registration form.
I do think it's aimed at keeping some demographics off the roll. Maybe that's not what it was initially used for, but I do think that that's what happens now. And I mean, the data shows that, with I think the 53,000 pending, it was like 70% people of color. And so even if you try to make the argument that that wasn't what it was intended, these are the actual consequences.
The problem's not a new one, but with a race this tight, it feels even more critical. Clearly, I need to put questions to the office enforcing electoral rules. But here's where that gets complicated. The man in charge is also
Brian Kemp,
the Republican candidate for governor, Georgia's Secretary of State, Brian Kemp. He's come to Cobb County, one of a handful that went for Hillary Clinton in Georgia in 2016. And he's accompanied today by White House royalty, the president's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump.
Hey guys! Ladies and gentlemen, I have great news for everyone. We are 7 days from victory right here in the state of Georgia.
And then he opted out of
He's refused our request for interview and his time is tight. But we try anyway.
Yes.
Secretary Kemp, you've been accused of voter suppression. Your response to that?
That's ridiculous. We're having a record turnout right now, minority participation up. We have 1 million more people on the rolls than we had when I took office.
You've got hundreds of thousands of people who've been purged from the register. Many of them are African American.
We are following state law. I took an oath to do that.
Is that your law? Is that your law?
No, it's the state law in Georgia that the legislature passed. I took an oath of office to defend and protect those laws. So did the Attorney General. You should get your facts straight about it.
He argues Abrams is trying to add people to the register who have no right to vote. Candidate Annette Davis backs him up. She knows Stacey Abrams. They attended the same school, Spelman College.
If Stacey Abrams is pushing voter suppression, first of all, African Americans do not vote in record numbers anyway, right? So to say that there's voter suppression, that's wrong, because there are people registered to vote, particularly African Americans, who do not vote.
Make sure you have your photo ID out and handy.
We asked congregations at the church and at the polls if anyone had experienced voter suppression. no one came forward. So is it all overplayed?
No, it's not been overplayed. Not at all. But I'm Caucasian, so I don't have any trouble.
Civil rights groups are suing Kemp now, alleging he's using his day job to suppress voter turnout.
In 2002, there were roughly around 20,000 Latino registered voters. Fast forward to 2018, we have from 2050 to 300,000 Latino registered voters.
Wow. And that fast-changing demographic explains why those in power are starting to worry. Pedro Marin is the first Hispanic elected to office in the state.
The purge of voters, and especially in minority communities, I think it's an effort to get that community away from the elections.
Why?
Because of the fear of losing power.
Georgia, Georgia.
So I called Stacey Abrams and I said, Stacey, this is open.
This race has become one of the hottest in the country. Surrogates on both sides have Georgia on their mind. But perhaps there should be a bigger wake-up call to questions about America's future. The next governor gets to influence who counts and who's erased from the picture.
I say just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind.
Well, that report from Georgia, but the thing to realise perhaps is that this contest is not just about one race in one place. It's a battle about the way America is fundamentally changing. Those deep red Republican states like Georgia, like Texas, like Arizona, which have their own nail-biting finishes too, are seeing their populations change, become younger, more urban, more Hispanic, less white. And it is this existential threat to the power base which perhaps explains why critics say these electoral changes, the gerrymandering of districts, are happening all over the place right now, a kind of state-sanctioned attempt to cling to power, whatever the cost. That's all from us tonight, but we'll be back here in Washington next week with all those midterm results and races, and we'll see you then. Mark.
Emily, we look forward to it.